This is the Fujifilm GFX100RF, and it's one of the most unique cameras I have ever used. If you're familiar with Fujifilm's extremely popular X100VI, you might look at this camera and think that it's just an enlarged version with a medium format sensor. However, there is a lot more to this camera's experience than that, so in today's video, we're gonna find out together what those distinctions are so you can learn if this camera is the right pick for you. By the end of this video, you should understand the following: why the design of this camera is so unique, what the experience of this camera is like, the best use cases I found for this camera, how this compares to other cameras on the market, who this camera is for. This video is sponsored by Ulanzi, more on them a bit later. If you have never shot Fujifilm before, you might think that the GFX100RF is just an obvious way for Fujifilm to capitalize on the huge success of the X100 series cameras. It feels like they just took the design elements like the rangefinder style body, extremely tactile controls, and compact lens from the X100 series and just made all of it bigger, right? Well, yes, but I think the design of this camera has a lot more nuance than that. To me, the GFX100RF represents decades of Fujifilm's experience making cameras, culminating in a design that, if you look closely, is a fairly bold camera. Let me explain. Most of the cameras at the price point of the GFX100RF that we see released today are some variation of a full-frame mirrorless camera that is then tied to a large ecosystem of lenses for you to choose from. By contrast, the GFX100RF is the opposite of this formula by being a medium format camera with a single fixed lens. If you're new to cameras, learning the subtle differences between every full-frame camera on the market and then comparing each system's huge library of established lenses is a really time-consuming, often confusing task. So part of the appeal of this design is how simple it makes the decision-making. Just a single camera body and the lens is picked for you. It feels like Fujifilm is making an investment to grow this segment of people who care more about the experience of a camera being unique over bleeding edge specs or even practicality to some extent. This is largely because image quality isn't a huge differentiating factor anymore. Another reason this feels like a bold release to me is Fujifilm took part of their limited supply of the best sensor they currently have available and put it in a camera that is designed for a very narrow and specific audience. If you know anything about manufacturing, this is a pretty expensive bet on this design, because they could have just made more of the GFX100 II, which seems to already be selling well despite its high-end price tag. Now, before we dive deep into if Fujifilm has successfully delivered on a unique experience with the GFX100RF, let's do a quick physical tour. As expected for the price, the body of this camera feels really premium. Most of the camera is precision machined from a single block of aluminum. The grip is not super pronounced, but it still manages to feel pretty good in the hand. Despite this camera being medium format, the GFX100RF remains relatively thin, keeping the size very manageable. At 735 grams, it's essentially the same weight as the popular full-frame Leica Q3, which is impressive. On the top of the camera, we have the shutter speed / ISO combo dial, the shutter button, a single custom button, exposure compensation, and the brand new aspect ratio dial, which we will talk a lot more about in a second. On the rear of the camera, we have a 3.2-inch LCD display, a lever for focus mode control, autofocus lock, settings dial, joystick, menu, display / back button, playback, dedicated drive mode button, and a tiny Q button on the far right. On the right of the camera, we have dual UHS 2 SD card slots, with all of the I/O being on the left, consisting of a microphone port, headphone jack, Type-C port that supports charging, and a micro HDMI. You could even technically use the GFX100RF as a webcam if you want to impress your friends with a medium format video feed. On the bottom, we have a standard quarter 20 mount with the battery door, and I am pleased to see that Fujifilm used the NPW235 battery that a lot of their other cameras have used over the past few years. Finally, around the front, we have a new teleconverter lever for cropping the sensor as if you were using different lenses, the main settings dial, the toggle lever that we've seen on the X100 series cameras, and finally, the brand new fixed 35mm f4 lens that equals to about a 28mm in full frame terms. In the box, the lens comes with this filter adapter ring that allows you to attach 49mm filter threads or the included square lens hood. If you want to retain weather sealing on the camera, you have to use this ring with a filter because the lens is otherwise not sealed. Thankfully, Fuji does include a UV filter in the box, so you don't have to source this yourself. When Fujifilm first announced this camera, I incorrectly assumed it would deliver a similar experience to the X100VI, just with a medium format look. The more I used the GFX100RF though, the more inaccurate that assumption became. I always found the X100VI excelled at quickly capturing candid moments as you go about the day. I think that's also why it was such a fun camera for street photography. The GFX100RF doesn't excel in these on-the-fly situations. There are a few reasons for this. First and most noticeably to me was the default 4:3 aspect ratio of this sensor. Maybe it's because I have spent so much time in my career composing in 3:2 for stills, I just don't yet have the sense for composing in 4:3 in these situations where other premium compacts have excelled. I consistently found myself feeling like the taller 4:3 aspect ratio didn't work for the kinds of shots I wanted. Of course, quickly changing your aspect ratio has never been easier than with this camera. This new aspect ratio dial is a fantastic addition, and we will talk about this plenty in a moment, but let's move on to my second point first. The lack of image stabilization paired with this slower f4 lens. These two things in combination means you are forced to use a slower shutter speed in all situations, and if you're someone who enjoys shooting at night or in low light, you're going to struggle unless you use a tripod or some other stabilization solution. Here's the surprise though. I actually think these limitations were a feature, not a bug, or at least that's how I treated them the more I used this camera. Getting used to this 4:3 aspect ratio, as well as being required to use a tripod for a lot of the shots I took on this camera, meant that I had no choice but to slow down my usual pace of shooting. I took more time per shot to really think about all the elements of the image, instead of from habit just walking by a spot, snapping a photo, and moving on quickly. This slower pace of shooting also had me enjoying the places I went with this camera more, which led me to take even more photos than I otherwise would have. This positive cycle kept looping for each new place I tried this camera. I had way more fun shooting with this camera than I expected. A lot of this came from the experimentation of this brand new aspect ratio dial. This dial represents more than just being able to quickly cycle through aspect ratios on this camera. It fundamentally changes the experience of photography because when you change your aspect ratio, you are literally changing the way you think about and see a shot. I've personally never really drastically cropped my images in post because if I was doing that, it meant that I got my composition wrong at the time of shooting. This aspect ratio dial helps you try compositions you may never have considered. This also keeps you more present and considerate about your composition as a whole. In a subtle way, I think this would lead to more skill improvement per shot over time, as well as less overshooting. If I didn't like how a shot was feeling, all I had to do was change the aspect ratio, and I typically found a frame that I preferred a lot more. The best part is you still retain the entire 4:3 sensor's wide shot, so if you change your mind in post, you aren't even technically locked in. I have to give Fuji a lot of credit for implementing aspect ratio into the workflow of this camera. I don't think I've ever used a camera that has kept composition as top of mind as the GFX100RF, and it does this effortlessly. The standout aspect ratio for me was 65:24, which is the same aspect ratio used in the classic Fujifilm TX1 film camera. This aspect ratio feels so cinematic, and I had a hard time not using it because I love the wide look that it provides. Now, with all of these positives, there are a few usability notes to keep in mind if you are considering this camera. The autofocus, while being pretty good for a sensor this large, is definitely not best in class. Though I was fairly impressed that I missed fewer shots of my son than I expected to, I also found myself wishing the display on this camera was a bit sharper. For landscape shots in particular, I ended up using manual focus a lot, but even when fully punching in, it was sometimes difficult to tell if what I wanted was in focus. This next one is minor, but I also found it unintuitive for the video mode to be under the drive mode settings on this camera. Thankfully, there is a dedicated drive mode button, so once you realize where it is, switching to video mode is relatively fast. Lastly, if you are big on shooting with Fujifilm recipes, it's worth mentioning that if you use heavy grain or the clarity setting, you will experience a fairly significant delay between shots because the camera spends a lot of processing power applying the recipe to each JPEG. Personally, I am not big on using Fujifilm recipes since I just edit the RAW files in post anyway, but if you don't like editing RAWs, keep this in mind. On the topic of editing, the file sizes of the GFX100RF are a massive 200 megabytes per RAW file. I took well over 1,000 photos on this camera during my time with it, which was a lot of images to select through and edit, but thankfully I did have a bit of help from today's sponsor, Ulanzi. They recently released the D200H, which is their take on a deck dock. This is essentially a collection of 13 programmable buttons that you can set to do anything on your computer faster. In my case, when editing in Adobe Lightroom, I set this up to do a bunch of shortcuts I commonly use that require more than one button press. For example, I often shoot multiple images at multiple exposures and then I combine them into an HDR image in Lightroom. But instead of navigating the menus or remembering the annoying 3-button shortcut for HDR merging in Lightroom, I was able to select the images and press one button on the D200H to do my HDR merge, which is way faster. This also only scratches the surface. I realized quickly that the deck dock could be used to help me get to my most used folders on my PC faster. I have a lot of folders I access daily on my PC when I am video editing, so I mapped all the most common ones across multiple pages on the D200H. So instead of clicking through multiple layers of folders when I need a single file, I now only have to press one button to open any of these folders instantly. You can add as many shortcut pages as you want, so no matter what application you use most, you can customize these buttons to do your work more easily. The dock even has various ports surrounding the entire unit for extra convenience when plugging in devices like SD cards, your phone, and SSDs. This thing is also relatively affordable, so if you care about saving time by avoiding tedious navigation on your computer, you can check out the D200H at the first link in the video description. Now let's talk about image quality. This 102 megapixel sensor from Fujifilm is still one of the best sensors I have ever experienced. It's genuinely shocking how much detail is retained even when you punch in on images from the GFX100RF. This is also the first time in a long time I think resolution actually makes a huge difference on a camera, because it's what allows all the available aspect ratios to work, without feeling like you lose a bunch of detail with the crop. The GFX100RF excels at shooting landscapes. My family and I spent every opportunity we could outside this summer and took this camera along exploring different parts of my home province of BC. This felt like the perfect use case. So many of the images I shot came back even better than I expected they would once I imported them into Lightroom. Something that surprised me as I edited the raw files is how much shadow detail can be pulled from images where I underexposed to protect my highlights. Here's an extreme example. Take a look at this shot of a tunnel. In the untouched raw file, all you can see is black. Once I bring up the shadows though, you can literally see more detail than I could see with my eyes when I took the shot. The shadows are also much cleaner than I have typically seen when you push a shot this far in a high contrast situation. From a color perspective, I think Fuji has one of the best renderings you can get from any camera brand. The process of being able to apply the film simulations to your raw files as a starting point, then add your own personal editing style on top, makes editing feel a lot less tedious than it might feel with other cameras. The brand new 35mm lens that Fuji designed specifically for this camera is super sharp without being clinical, and if you use it without the included filter ring, it is really surprising how small they were able to make this lens. That being said, if you like shooting portraits with a really shallow depth of field, this camera won't really deliver that look. At f4 with a medium wide lens like this, you just don't get that much separation from your subject unless you are really close up. Close focus on this lens is pretty good though at 20 centimeters or 7.87 inches from your subject. I do hope that Fujifilm makes at least one telephoto adapter for this camera like they have on the X100 series. Most of the time, the 35mm worked perfectly, and I do really enjoy how small this lens is for a medium format setup. There was just certain places I just wanted a bit more reach for the shot I saw in my head, and having a small telephoto adapter would have been a great solution for these moments. I also wouldn't recommend pushing the ISO on this camera too far. Especially with the f4 lens, you aren't going to get amazing low light images despite this being a fairly large sensor. In general, I am never a fan of relying on ISO performance to achieve the exposure you want, but if you are in a pinch, going up to around 3200 ISO can still produce usable results. Video performance on the GFX100RF is a bit of a mixed bag. While this does use the same sensor as the very capable GFX100 footage recorded with the GFX100RF is pixel binned versus oversampled, which does make the footage look less sharp and detailed versus what you would get on other Fujifilm cameras. This camera shoots up to 4K 30fps in 10-bit 422, and you can shoot in F-Log2. Reviewing the footage, when you look at big wide shots that have a lot of different things going on, you may start to notice the lack of detail compared to more video-centric cameras. That being said, from a color standpoint, because you can shoot in F-Log2, you can make this footage look and feel pretty good. I doubt you'll be turning to video on this camera very often, but if you end up taking this camera up to difficult to get to places, like the top of a mountain, it's nice that you can capture some solid footage to go along with your stills. Fuji also included a 4-stop built-in ND filter, and I think this is a good amount of ND to be built in for super bright days. I did end up using a variable ND filter when the 4-stop was either too much or not quite enough, but unless you are super picky about getting perfect exposure in video like I am, this probably isn't necessary for you most of the time. The video mode also has digital image stabilization, and while the crop is pretty significant at 1.32x, the stabilization does actually do a decent job of keeping footage steady as long as you aren't walking around. So if you need a rock solid shot, this works a lot better than other digital stabilization that I have encountered in other cameras this year. Overall, it's cool to see that even in a very photography focused camera like this, it's still possible to get decent video when you want to. Just don't expect it to perform as well as something like the GFX100 or another video centric camera. If you are considering the GFX100RF, there is probably at least one other camera you might look at in comparison, the Leica Q3. Now, while it might seem fairly logical to compare these two cameras, I think they are good at very different use cases. The faster f1.7 lens on the Q3 is going to perform a lot better for candid portraits and handheld low-light street photography than the Fuji. On the flip side, I think the resolution the GFX100RF brings is amazing for landscapes and any shot where you want to capture something grand like a building. Having used both cameras extensively, the Fuji forced me to think a lot harder about my composition than the Q3 did, which I really enjoyed. The GFX100RF is also $1,000 less expensive than the Q3, but price aside, I think it comes down to what your experience preference and shooting style is. The simplest way I could boil this down is if you have a faster, more energetic pace when you shoot, the Q3 is probably where you should lean. If you prefer a slower, more controlled approach, then the GFX100RF is probably more for you. Either way, they are both great cameras, you just need to match it to the pace of the work that you want to do. There is a lot more I could say about this comparison, but for the sake of time, I will leave it there. If you want a full video comparing these cameras as well as possibly the Sony RX1R Mark III, once I have tried it, comment, compare below, and if enough people are interested, I'll make that video. The GFX100RF is one of the most unique digital cameras I have ever used. If you love the process of photography as much or more than the end result of your images, you will probably love this camera. Of course, it's not perfect. I hope in a future version they release a camera with a faster lens and image stabilization. However, the GFX100RF is the kind of shooting experience that motivates you to find interesting or novel places to visit just so that you can shoot with it more, with the ultimate benefit of that being that you add more interesting experiences to your life. I haven't used a camera this year that has made photography more fun than this camera. I think that's because of Fujifilm's laser focus on finding additions like the aspect ratio dial to add uniqueness to the process of creating photos you are proud of. I don't know about you, but for me, a camera that slows me down, keeps me more present and thoughtful is also a camera that has me enjoying and remembering why I shoot in the first place. Photography is one of the most satisfying crafts out there. However, because like me, you may do this for work, I think it's easy to let the images you create fly by sometimes, instead of taking a step back to appreciate the process. I'm really glad Fujifilm took a risk and made this camera because it does deliver on the best parts of photography. If you are okay with working at a slower pace and you care more about your shooting experience than you do about top tier specs or even versatility, there is a good chance you will have a ton of fun with this camera. This uniqueness does come at a hefty price, but it is at least in line with the other cameras like it on the market. I'd love to hear what you think. Is this camera worth the novelty, or would you rather buy something else? And if so, what? Let me know in the comments down below, and thank you so much for spending time with me today.